The Spiral Abyss, a mysterious spire that is home to 12 floors, with each floor containing 3 chambers of enemies, and at the top is floor 12, which is filled with the hardest enemies that you must bring 2 teams in for because it now has 2 halves, in which you must complete both halves in under 3 minutes. And over the years, people have recorded their data of their complete runs in floor 12, so we'll be going over basically the meta of the Spiral Abyss. Before we get started, the information for the characters used for floor 12 only dates back to version 1.4, so everybody before version 1.3 has been released, and the newest character this patch is 4-star Rosaria. By the way, how the percentages work in this list is where it shows how many people use the character divided by how many people own that character in total. Now starting with 1.4, the most popular DPSs are Ganyu, Hu Tao, and Zhao, with the best supports being Zhongli, Xingqiu, Bennett, Venti, Jean, Mona, and Albedo. Some notes about the old meta are, standard 5 stars were popular picks, which makes sense due to having limited options, like even Chi-Chi is more popular than Xiangling and Fischl, while Qing sits below all of them because no quicken. Anyways, there's others like Barbara, Changyu, Ningguang, and Noelle being popular, even though some of them are pretty underwhelming. Now, the least popular characters were Beidou, Traveler, Kea, Razor, Amber, Xinyan, and Lisa, which is kinda expected because most of them are bad, while Beidou and Kea are both kinda weird, I guess. Oh, and also no Rosaria data this patch. Next in 1.5, Eula and Yanfei have come out. Eula is a physical DPS in a game where elemental reactions do most of the work, as well as having no support anyways, even in the future. And Yanfei is a pyro DPS who's worse than Klee. And their pick rates are Eula with 38%, which isn't too bad, and Yanfei with a 2% pick rate, which is incredibly low, which is kinda expected because the game has 4 pyro DPSs at this point. And some interesting stuff about the older characters are, Venti has a 30% increase in pick rate, which meant the Abyss was good for grouping. Xiangling's pick rate gone up by 15%, likely because people slept on Xiangling back in the day. Beidou as well as Sucrose get an increase in pick rate. Lastly, Diana gets a massive increase in usage because she's part of a popular team back then called the Morgana Comp, which is a team with Diona, Ganyu, Mona, and Venti. And the team did quadratic damage, which doesn't really matter now because of the power creep, as well as making the Abyss less exploitable by Venti. Anyways, the standard 5 stars have a dip in play rate, probably because more people have done these surveys so it drops their pick rates. Kazuha comes out with the final patch of Li Wei, who is one of the best supports in the game, having both good buffs and decent grouping, making his pick rate at a pretty good 67%. For the others, Xiangling has another increase in pick rate, as well as Changyun by a huge 20% because someone in the community pulled the greatest lie and told everyone that this dude is good with Xiangling, Xingqiu, and Bennett, which was wrong at the time because both Sucrose and Fischl are in this game. Anyways, Albedo's pick rate goes down by 34%, as well as Zhongli by a bit, probably due to this Abyss having a lot of enemies resistant to geo damage. Releasing with Inazuma is Ayaka, Yoimiya, Sayu, and Electro Traveler. Ayaka is definitely the best in the patch, being a top cryo DPS alongside Ganyu because of her damage being so high. Yoimiya is a pyro DPS who at this point is a bit worse than Hu Tao and Xiangling. Sayu, plain and simple, is worse Jean, and Electro Traveler is the worst character here. For this patch, Ayaka's pick rate is at a considerable 65%, while Yoimiya is at 14%, Sayu at 1%, and Electro Traveler is even lower at 0.4%. Over here, Kazuha is outclassing Venti as the best animal support, and thankfully Changyun has fallen off with a 22% drop. Lastly, for some reason, Eula and Albedo get a spike in pick rate, while Klee, Sucrose, Ganyu, and Zhao drop in play rate. Next patch is another 4 characters, Raiden Shogun, Kokomi, Kujusara, and Alloy. Raiden Shogun is a pretty good electro DPS, creating a popular team of Xingqiu, Xiangling, and Bennett, while later becoming one of the best Hyper Bloom triggers. Kokomi is a pretty good Hydro unit with being both a healer and having good Hydro application. Kujusara is an attack and buff support, similar to Bennett, but is typically thought to be more of an electro support because of her C6. And Alloy is the worst cryo DPS, who's also only available in a collab from 2021. And the pick rates were Raiden Shogun with a 69%, Kokomi has 25% because for one reason or another, people thought she wasn't good, I guess. Anyways, Alloy has less than 1% and Kujusara is at 9%. And for the rest of the cast, a ton of people fall in love, but at least Yoimiya gains a 20% in pick rate. This next patch is a small one, only having Toma, who is a pyro shielder, and later when Denjo is released becomes a burgeon trigger, except that he's pretty bad at doing that though. At least his pick rate is at 11%, which is pretty good for a 4-star. In this Abyss, everybody goes up and down by a bit, but most importantly, Kokomi goes up by 17% because the community is finding out that she's actually pretty good, while Eula and Yoimiya are falling out of favor. Now this patch releases Arataki Ito and Goro. Ito is a Geo DPS who scales with defense, and his support Goro is a Geo unit who boosts defense, with Ito having a 59% pick rate and Goro having a 70% pick rate. And this time around, surprisingly, no one in this patch falls off too much, and everyone goes up in play rate except for Amber. Next is Shenhe and Yunjin. Shenhe is a 5-star crowd support that gives a buff that only affects crowd characters, while Yunjin is a Geo support who only gives a small buff to normal attacks. And Shenhe is pretty good at 57%, although Yunjin is pretty low at 3%, while Venti takes a massive 65% drop, signifying the amount of immovable enemies this Abyss. Also, a ton of other characters take hits in pick rate. 2.5 brings only Yeimiko, a 5-star electro DPS who also gets better when Denjiro is released, and she has a 48% pick rate, which is pretty high. Thankfully, Chongyun has fallen down to a 1% pick rate, as well as characters used in freeze teams. But it seems like Geo teams are back this patch, however Xiao drops by 23%. Next patch brings Ayato, a Hydro DPS that can be played in most teams but isn't as good as Kokomi or Child. However, he does have a very high pick rate at 71%, but for the first time, Bennett drops to 56%. Shangling also drops with Zhongli and Albedo as well, with a lot of others falling probably because of the Pyro and Hydro shields in that Abyss. 2.7 releases Yelan and Kuki Shinobu. Yelan is simply a 5-star Xingqiu who's broken, and Kuki Shinobu is an electro healer who's more commonly known for triggering Hyper Bloom when that is released in 3.0. So it's kinda expected to see that Yelan's pick rate is at 66% while Kuki's wasn't recorded at all. And for the Abyss, Ayato and Freeze teams have dropped, with the best teams now being vaporized using Yoimiya with Yelan because the community thought it would be good. Also, Ito, Ye, and Zhao are good this patch, with the last patch in Inazuma being Hazel, an animal support who's similar to Sucrose but worse, which reflects in his pick rate being only 6%, and Kuki only has 3%, which without Hyper Bloom is kinda expected. For the others, most of them stay relatively the same, except Sucrose, Albedo, Zhao, Eula, Ito, and Ayato who fall. Moving on to Sumeru is the release of Tignari, Dendro Traveler, Dori, as well as Kole. Tignari is a Dendro DPS who works best with Yeimiko and Quicken. Dendro Traveler is the best off-field Dendro at the moment. Kole is a bit worse than Traveler, but is still useful in 15 or 25 second rotation. And Dori is another electro healer for Hyper Bloom, but is worse than Kuki at triggering those blooms. And Tignari's pick rate is at 90%, Dendro Traveler is at 14%, which are both pretty good, while Kole is at 2% and Dori isn't even shown this patch. However, this patch, people didn't utilize Hyper Bloom or Quicken and just stuck with the usual teams back before Sumeru, aka Freeze and Vaporize. Next is Sino, Nilu, and Candice. Sino is a Quicken carry who I believe isn't as good as Raiden or Yeimiko. Nilo is a specialist who causes blooms to explode immediately, making her the best in AoE, and Candice is a Hydro buffer who's supposedly similar to Xingqiu and Yelan but worse. With Sino's pick rate at 25%, which is lower than Raiden, Candice who barely has less than a percent, and Nilu has a 54% because this Abyss was made for her. With everyone going down in use except Electro and Dendro units, probably because of Simon who has a Quicken mechanic. Oh, and Dori from last patch has a 1% usage rate. Now with the release of Nihida and Layla 2 I guess, Dendro becomes absolutely broken because Nihida is the best at applying Dendro with basically infinite range and duration as long as you apply the debuff, and Layla is just a cryo shielder who can be played on a lot of teams. For Nihida, she has a 62% pick rate, while Layla has a pretty low 4%. And this Abyss seems to be a vaporized Abyss, with Hu Tao and Yoimiya being popular, as well as other build users because there is a Drake boss that flies away from you. Wanderer and Faruzan both come out in 3.3. Wanderer is an animal DPS who's similar to Zhao, and Faruzan is an animal support who supports only and Nemo carries. And with Wanderer's pick rate being at 19%, while Faruzan's at 12%, which is kinda unpopular even with how popular Scaramouche was, but I guess he was a disappointment. Anyways, in this Abyss, there's the Wolf Lord boss, which kinda requires Geo, so people have built around that. Next patch is Alhaitham and Yao Yao. Alhaitham is another Quicken Dendro carry like Tignari, while Yao Yao is a Dendro healer who can be used for teams like Nilo Bloom and Quicken, while Hytham having a 57% pick rate and Yao Yao has 16%, which are both really high for their respective areas. And for the older characters, Geo units fall down and Hyper Bloom becomes a lot more popular. Now for what I believe is one of the worst patches in the game, 3.5 brings us Dea and Mika. Dea is both a burgeon trigger as well as an on-feuder, but doesn't do both roles good at all. And Mika is a physical damage buffer as well as a healer, but has only one good physical carry, which is Eula. With Dea, she has a 26% pick rate, and Mika wasn't even recorded at all. And the Abyss itself, it looks like Vaporize is slightly more popular, and Hyperloom is slightly less popular. New releases for 3.6 are Baiju and Kave. Baiju is a Dendro healer who's second to Nahida for being the best off-field Dendro, and Kave is a Dendro DPS who explodes bloom cores and is like the worst thing ever made. Nice thing to know is that this data was recorded before they both even came out. But at least I can tell you that Mika has a 0.8% pick rate and Dea falls off by 20%. And this patch was an AoE Abyss, so Nilu gets a big boost, while the other side was a team that both has an Electro unit as well as a bow user because of Drake. For 3.7, it's just a single character, Kirarar, who is a Dendro Shearer that's worse than Baiju, who released right before her. Kirarar's pick rate is 6%, which is kinda good for a 4-star, and Baiju from last patch has 43%, while Kave has 1%. However, this Abyss was definitely the hardest in the game, and it's only because the first floor had the Cryo and Hydro Heralds, while the next floor had an Electro Immune Thunder Manifestation, and finally the Baptist boss, which also has a Cryo, Hydro, and Pyro Shield. By the way, all on the same half. So it basically forced you into playing a Burgeon team, while the other half had to have a grouper in it to speedrun it. So you can have enough time to break the shields as well as being good enough at single target because it had a boss as well. So people didn't use Nilu or even Yelan because the Cryo Heralds did a lot of damage while under Bennett's burst. Kazuha, Bennett, Xingqiu, and Shangling had their pick rates boosted while mostly everyone else dropped because of how limiting this Abyss was. Finally, for the last patch in Sumeru, it ends with no one being released, which is kind of disappointing. However, Kirarar's pick rate stayed fairly the same, and this Abyss was an AoE Abyss made for Nilu, while the other half forced you to use an Electro, so Quicken or Hyper Bloom it was, with Vaporize falling back down. Moving on to Fontaine, Linny, Lynette, and Fremine come out. Linny is a Pyro DPS that only wants to be played in mono Pyro teams. Lynette is an animal support who's on a similar level to Hazel, while still being not as good as Sucrose. And Fremine is a Cryo DPS who's based on freezing and shattering. And obviously, 5-star Linny has a 44% pick rate. Lynette gets only a 0.6%, while Fremine didn't even get recorded this patch. And for this Abyss, Hyperbloom was best for the first half because the crab had a huge Pyro shield, while Mono Pyro or Vaporize was good for the other half, as well as a grouper if you liked. Now, after a year of Hyperbloom and Vaporize, 1.1 releases Nuvilet and Risley. Nuvilet is the most broken DPS to ever be released, being able to solo Abyss at the time of his release. And Risley is a Cryo DPS who works well in both freeze and melt teams. Anyhow, Nuvilet has a huge 70% pick rate, while Risley gets only a 19%. Now with the older characters, all the pick rates of Hydro characters go down because of Nuvilet, as well as a lot of Pyro characters because they don't work well with him. Next patch brings another broken character, Farina, and also Charlotte. Farina grants everyone a huge buff when someone's health changes, as well as enabling that by draining it. And Charlotte is just a team-wide cryo healer who's probably only played with Farina. Anyways, Farina has an insane 89% pick rate, while Charlotte only has 7%. However, even though Farina likes healers, only Baiju and Jean's pick rates go up, while the rest of the healers go down, and obviously Nuvilet and Risley go up by a decent amount because of her. 4.3 releases Navia and Chevreuse. Navia is a Geo DPS who revolves around Crystallized, loading up a huge shotgun blast, while Chevreuse is an Overlord support who can only support a team whose members are Pyro and Electro units, with Navia being at a good 50% and Chevreuse at 8%, which is pretty respectful for both characters. Nuvilet is still doing great, therefore Kokomi's pick rate is going down the drain. While Navia's teammates such as Zhongli and Bennett get a boost, but Kazuha goes down by a lot for some reason. Releasing for Chinese New Year is Shanyun in gaming. Shanyun is an enable support for plunge attacks while also being a party-wide healer for Marina, and gaming is a 4-star pyro plunge DPS. Anyways, Shanyun has a 29% pick rate while gaming only gets a 1%. And for this abyss, it has both Weena and the Drake boss on the second half. So Yelan and Tignari's pick rate are up while Navia isn't as popular as before, and also Yimiko is up, and surprisingly Ayaka Freeze is also up. Next up is Chiori, a defense scaling Geo DPS that's similar to Albedo, but also powers up if any Geo constructs are on the field. And she has a 53% pick rate, which is pretty good. However, in this abyss, Geo units are up, and of course, Nivelle and Farina are still good, while Dendro and Freeze teams are kinda lacking because the amount of elemental shields. 4.6 brings us Arlecchina, one of the more powerful pyro DPSs in the game, coming in with a 70% pick rate, which is very high. And this time, Geo goes down, while Vaporize and Nivelle are on top, with the rest of the characters getting either the same or less usage. Next patch review is Cloran, Siegewin, and Sethos. Cloran is a quickened Electro DPS who is on similar footing to Ye. Siegewin is a Hydro, party-wide healer I think, and Sethos is a quickened Electro carry in the same patch as Cloran. Anyways, he has 0.3% pick rate while Cloran has a 38% and Siegewin is at 18%, which are all pretty low. However, quickened teams had it with this abyss while Vaporize wasn't doing as good. For the final patch of Fontaine, it's just a single character, Amelie, who is a Dendro DPS that's optimally used in burning teams, and with her pick rate being 38%, she's pretty average. And this abyss leans towards power units because of the Hydro immune enemies, and you just put Nuvile on the other side. All the other teams don't really matter, however, for some reason, Navia, Chiori, and Zhao are popping off. In Natlan, Mulani, Kinich, and Kachina come out. Mulani is a Hydro DPS who's not as good as Nivelle. Kinich is a Dendro DPS who prefers burning teams. And Kachina is a Geo DPS who scales with defense and also has a Geo construct. But all their pick rates are low, with Mulani and Kinich at 24% and Kachina is only at 2%. This patch is a bit weird though because Nivelle's pick rate goes down while some like Arlecchino goes up. So I guess there's character diversity except for Farina, who's the best support. And for the final patch covering this video features Shilonin, who is a Geo support that gives similar buffs to Kazuha, but has some slight differences in that she heals people and also buffs Geo characters as well. And since Kazuha is broken, Shilonin is also broken at a high 74% pick rate. Also with that, Navia synergizes with her very well, so her pick rate goes up. While a lot of the older characters like Shangling, Xingqiu, Nahida, and Baizhu are losing in pick rate. But in all, that's been the meta of the Spiral Abyss. It started off with Freeze Ganyu and Vaporize Hu Tao and Mondstadt / Li Wei, then Freeze Ayaka and Overvate Raiden Shogun in Inazuma. Next is Hyperbloom plus whatever in Sumeru, to Nivelle Farina, and then like Quicken, Hyperbloom, or Vaporize in Fontaine. And finally, as of right now in Natlan, I'm pretty sure it's still the same because the actual carries in Natlan haven't come out yet. So bye bye.